"You're done here. Step aside." Those were the unspoken words behind the smile as she tossed my things into the yard. She believed she had all the power, that I would retreat quietly. She was wrong. I had a plan, and it began the moment I stood there, silent, watching. The morning sun was weak, filtering through the half-closed curtains, casting long shadows across the scattered remains of my life. Clothes that had been folded with care were now damp with dew. Family photos lay in the grass, some smeared with mud. My husband's favorite armchair sat crookedly on the lawn, a silent testament to years of memories being ignored. Danielle, my daughter-in-law, stood at the edge of the chaos with that infuriatingly serene smile, as if she had won some great victory. My body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a controlled fury that demanded patience. This was my house, my legacy, and no amount of arrogance would rewrite that truth. I remembered the first time I had invited Danielle into this home years ago. She had seemed sweet, polite, the kind of woman I had hoped my son would cherish. But over the years, subtle shifts occurred, barely noticeable at first. The way she questioned my decisions, the way she rearranged things when she thought I wasn't looking, the slight smirk when she spoke about my financial contributions. These were breadcrumbs that led to this moment. I had allowed her to think she had leverage, and now she believed she was untouchable. I took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp scent of wet grass mixed with the faint aroma of lilies from the vase on the porch. The world seemed calm, almost indifferent to the turmoil unfolding in my yard, and that calm would be my ally. Anger, if expressed too soon, could cloud judgment. I needed clarity, patience, and strategy. I would not confront Danielle with shouting or accusations. That was beneath me. Instead, I would let actions speak louder than words. Walking slowly around the yard, I examined each item as if seeing them for the first time. A framed photo of my husband and me on our wedding day had a crack in the glass, and my favorite sweater was soaked and dirtied. Each object told a story, and each story screamed betrayal. Yet amidst the chaos, I found a small, undeniable spark of opportunity. This was the proof I needed to demonstrate not just ownership of the house, but ownership of respect, dignity, and memory. I stepped into the house for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of history in each room. The floors creaked under my feet, the walls still held echoes of laughter and family meals, and the kitchen smelled faintly of the soup I had left simmering the night before. Danielle had tried to erase my presence here, but the house itself bore my imprint. It remembered me. I was part of its very walls, its foundation, and she could not take that away. I picked up my phone and dialed Daniel Cow, my lawyer. His calm voice on the other end was a balm to my frayed nerves. "I need guidance," I said, keeping my tone even. "My daughter-in-law has taken liberties in my absence. I need to ensure the house and everything in it remains mine." He responded with the quiet confidence I had come to rely on over the years. "We'll handle this. Keep your composure, watch, and document everything." That was all I needed to hear. Patience was not passive. It was power. As I hung up, Danielle approached with feigned concern. "Mom, I was just trying to help," she said, her voice dripping with faux innocence. I nodded slowly, smiling faintly, allowing her words to hang in the air like smoke. Yes, she was trying to help herself perhaps, but that would not deter me. I had already begun my own plan, one that required no shouting, no theatrics, only quiet observation and the careful gathering of proof. The next hours passed in a haze of measured actions. I documented everything: photographs, notes, timestamps. Each movement Danielle made, each careless rearrangement, was recorded. I kept my composure perfectly, speaking only when necessary, choosing words that revealed nothing of my inner calculations. She mistook silence for submission, but silence was my weapon. In every detail, I was asserting control, unseen but unyielding. By mid-afternoon, the yard was still a mess, but my resolve had solidified. I walked through the rooms again, touching familiar objects, whispering gentle affirmations to myself about justice, dignity, and legacy. I thought of my husband, of the years invested in this home, and of the quiet strength that had been passed down through generations of women in my family. I would honor that strength today. I would not be erased. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the chaos, I felt a subtle shift within me. The anger that had threatened to consume me was now tempered into clarity and determination. Danielle might have believed she held all the cards, but she had underestimated one thing: patience, knowledge, and the quiet, unwavering will of someone who knows her own worth. She was about to learn that being in control of a home was not the same as controlling a life. The first steps of my plan had been laid. Observing, documenting, and maintaining my composure were the foundations. Legal guidance awaited, but even before that, the house had already spoken. Each wall, each floorboard, each object bore witness to my presence, my memory, and my claim. I would act, yes, but with precision, with dignity, and with the subtle power that had carried me through every challenge in my life. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool evening breeze brushing against my face. Danielle watched me, still smiling, unaware that she had walked into a carefully constructed web of strategy and quiet justice. The house was mine, the legacy was mine, and soon the recognition of that fact would be undeniable. For now, I simply stood there, silent, watching, and waiting. Power need not be loud. Sometimes it only needed patience, and I had plenty. As I stood on the porch, watching Danielle fidget with the stack of my old letters, I couldn't help but think about how it had all come to this. This house had been my sanctuary, built over decades with careful hands, tireless labor, and an endless commitment to family. Every corner held memories: the kitchen where my children had learned to cook, the study where my husband and I planned our future, the garden where I had planted roses that bloomed each spring without fail. It was more than just walls and floors. It was a testament to a life lived fully, to love and labor invested with care and intention. And now, in my absence, it was under siege. Years ago, I had welcomed Danielle with open arms. She had been polite, attentive, seemingly kind. I had hoped for a daughter-in-law who would love my son as I had loved him, who would cherish our family's values. At first, she had seemed sincere, but subtle signs began to appear. Little questions about expenses that weren't hers to question, small suggestions to update things that needed no updating, slight smirks when she commented on my modest habits. At the time, I dismissed these as youthful ambition or overeagerness. I had wanted to see the best in people, and in Danielle I had once believed I did. But over the years, those small incidents grew. She started to test boundaries, pushing into spaces where she didn't belong. My son, ever loyal to her, often laughed off her manipulations or scolded me for being too sensitive. I began to realize that my patience was being exploited, that the kindness I had extended was being mistaken for weakness. And yet, I never imagined she would go this far, that she would attempt to claim my home while I was away grieving. The audacity of it left a bitter taste in my mouth. I poured myself a cup of tea in the quiet of the kitchen, savoring the warmth as if it were armor. Each sip reminded me of mornings spent planning family meals, the aroma of freshly baked bread filling the rooms. Memories flooded back, both comforting and painful. The house carried history, yes, but it also carried proof. Proof that I had cared, that I had invested myself fully. That proof would now become my shield. My thoughts drifted to the legal aspects, to the discussions I would soon have with Daniel Cow. The deed was in my name, the documents clean, the estate intact. Danielle, I realized, had not accounted for that. She had assumed ownership in my absence, believing she could act with impunity. That miscalculation would be her undoing. Quietly, methodically, I began to map out each step I would take to ensure that my rights were recognized, my property secured, and my dignity restored. I remembered conversations with friends who had faced similar situations. They had warned me that confrontation could escalate into chaos, that anger could cloud judgment. I had listened, absorbed their advice, and internalized it. Patience was not weakness, it was preparation. Each moment I observed Danielle, each careful note I made was part of a larger strategy. The house itself became an ally, each object a witness to the truth. Walking through the living room, I noticed how the sun hit the furniture, highlighting the scratches she had carelessly left behind, the rearranged chairs, the dust upturned in her haste. Every detail mattered. Each smudge on a photograph, each misplaced book, each disrupted vase was evidence. Evidence that she had overstepped, that she had failed to respect boundaries. Evidence that once revealed would speak louder than any shouting or argument ever could. I paused at the staircase, fingers tracing the banister my husband had polished countless times. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a surge of determination. I would not be ignored, nor would I be silenced. Danielle had underestimated the resolve of someone who had built a life from scratch, who had nurtured a family, and who understood the value of careful, deliberate action. The house had been my life's work, and now it would serve as a stage for justice. As evening approached, I retreated to the study, surrounded by ledgers, letters, and personal journals. Each document told a story, chronicling decades of dedication, care, and love. I began organizing them meticulously, preparing for the moment when they would need to be presented. Each entry, each receipt, each note would reinforce my claim and reveal the truth. Danielle's arrogance had blinded her to the power of preparation, and that oversight would soon become apparent. In the quiet moments, I reflected on my relationship with my son. He had always been loving, but he had also been easily swayed. Danielle's influence had grown gradually, insidiously, until I found myself sidelined in my own home. It was a painful realization, but also an important one. Understanding the dynamics of manipulation would be crucial in navigating the coming days. I would need to act with precision, balancing emotion with strategy. Night fell, and the house grew silent, except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. I stood by the window, looking out at the lawn where my belongings lay scattered, the evidence of Danielle's audacity. The stars above seemed indifferent to the struggle below, yet they reminded me that patience and endurance were virtues as old as time itself. I would move carefully, quietly, but decisively. Every choice I made from this point forward would be measured, each step designed to reclaim not just property, but respect and authority. By the time I retired to bed, my plan was clear in my mind. Observations recorded, documents organized, allies contacted. Danielle believed she had the upper hand, but she had misjudged me entirely. I had the law on my side, the evidence in hand, and most importantly, the quiet determination of someone who had faced far greater challenges in life. Tomorrow, the work would begin in earnest, and this time, the house would bear witness not to her arrogance, but to my resolve. The following morning, I awoke with a sense of purpose that replaced the heavy weight of grief and betrayal. Danielle had expected me to react with panic or indignation, but I had chosen the steadier course: observation, documentation, and preparation. Breakfast passed in silence, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the kitchen as Danielle moved around, carefully avoiding eye contact with me. She had no idea that every step she took, every object she touched was being recorded. I began systematically cataloging the evidence of her intrusions. Photographs of the scattered belongings, notes about each item, timestamps of when I discovered them, all carefully logged. The letters she had carelessly tossed, some containing financial information or personal memories, were carefully collected and stored in a secure folder. Each document was another piece of proof that her audacity extended beyond ignorance. It was intentional. This would not be a confrontation of words, but a demonstration of fact, undeniable and precise. Throughout the day, I observed her interactions with neighbors and friends who came to check on the commotion. Danielle attempted a facade of charm, explaining that she was helping clean up the house while I was away. But her words rang hollow to anyone paying attention. I documented their reactions, subtle signs of skepticism and concern that would serve as corroboration later. Each detail reinforced my understanding that control could be asserted through patience and evidence, not shouting or dramatics. The following morning, I awoke with a sense of purpose that replaced the heavy weight of grief and betrayal. Danielle had expected me to react with panic or indignation, but I had chosen the steadier course: observation, documentation, and preparation. Breakfast passed in silence, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the kitchen as Danielle moved around, carefully avoiding eye contact with me. She had no idea that every step she took, every object she touched was being recorded. I began systematically cataloging the evidence of her intrusions. Photographs of the scattered belongings, notes about each item, timestamps of when I discovered them, all carefully logged. The letters she had carelessly tossed, some containing financial information or personal memories, were carefully collected and stored in a secure folder. Each document was another piece of proof that her audacity extended beyond ignorance. It was intentional. This would not be a confrontation of words, but a demonstration of fact, undeniable and precise. Throughout the day, I observed her interactions with neighbors and friends who came to check on the commotion. Danielle attempted a facade of charm, explaining that she was helping clean up the house while I was away. But her words rang hollow to anyone paying attention. I documented their reactions, subtle signs of skepticism and concern that would serve as corroboration later. Each detail reinforced my understanding that control could be asserted through patience and evidence, not shouting or dramatics. By midday, I called Daniel Cow to report the situation. I have gathered extensive documentation, I explained. Photographs, notes, timestamps. She is acting without authority and I have proof. His calm tone reassured me. Excellent. Keep observing, continue documenting, and avoid direct confrontation. This is about precision, not emotion. That simple guidance reinforced my own commitment to measured action. I would reclaim what was mine without stooping to chaos or anger. Danielle, sensing some form of resistance, began to act more aggressively, attempting to move furniture and rearrange rooms to her liking. Each action was more careless than the last. She underestimated my awareness, believing that my silence signaled weakness. But I was deliberate, noting each movement, each misstep, each potential violation of ownership. This accumulation of evidence would soon demonstrate a clear pattern of overreach and intent. The turning point of the day came when I discovered a set of emails Danielle had attempted to hide, correspondence that revealed her plans to sell certain furniture and manipulate estate matters in my absence. My heart raced, not with panic, but with anticipation. Here was the leverage I needed, the confirmation that her actions were calculated, and that the house, my sanctuary, had become the battlefield of her ambition. I copied each email, printed a record, and stored it alongside my other documentation. Each piece would tell a story, and the story would favor the truth. As the afternoon progressed, I decided to observe her from the study, a vantage point that allowed me to watch her movements while remaining unobtrusive. Danielle moved with exaggerated care, perhaps believing that I was oblivious to her actions. She failed to notice the small camera I had set up or the careful notes I was taking, detailing the precise sequence of events. Each moment of overconfidence on her part was a moment in my favor, an opportunity to turn arrogance into evidence. By evening, I had completed a comprehensive log of the day's events. Every room, every object, every attempt at unauthorized action was meticulously recorded. I reviewed the notes, ensuring clarity and accuracy, and filed them with the corresponding photographs and printed emails. The accumulation of evidence was no longer just preparation. It had become a shield. Danielle's own missteps would provide the foundation for restoring order, dignity, and rightful ownership. In the quiet of the late afternoon, I reflected on the strategies I had employed. Observation, documentation, patience. These were the weapons of someone who understood the value of restraint. Anger would have clouded my judgment. Confrontation would have invited chaos. Instead, I had allowed the situation to unfold in full view, gathering the facts, building a case, and asserting control without uttering a single threatening word. Power, I reminded myself, is often quiet. Night settled over the house, casting long shadows across the rooms Danielle had touched and the yard where my belongings had once lain. I walked through each space, visualizing the steps to come. A meeting with Daniel Cow, presentation of the evidence, and the legal reclamation of my home. Each scenario played in my mind with clarity and precision. I would not fail. I had prepared, documented, and observed. Every advantage was on my side. Before retiring, I placed the final items of the day into a secure folder, ensuring that nothing could be lost or questioned. Danielle believed she had undermined me, that she had seized power in my absence. But the truth, carefully recorded and strategically presented, would reveal the reality. The house, the memories, the legacy all remained mine. I would reclaim them with dignity, authority, and the quiet, unstoppable resolve that had carried me through every challenge in my life. The discovery felt almost anticlimactic. It began with a slip of paper tucked under a cushion, a note that had fallen out of an envelope and drifted into a seam where dust gathered. I found it by accident as I was cataloging the day's events, a small oversight that revealed a much larger one. The note referenced a meeting, a date, and a name I did not recognize at first. When I followed the thread, it led to 2 printed emails I had saved earlier but had not yet examined closely. They were routine at first glance, but contained a pattern that could not be dismissed. I called Daniel and asked him to come by. He arrived with the steady gait and quiet assurance that had comforted me in more than one storm. We sat at the kitchen table surrounded by folders, photographs, and printouts. Sunlight pooled across the documents and made everything appear more official than it had a moment before. Daniel read through the emails slowly, his finger tracing lines that I had already memorized. He did not look surprised. He looked pleased in that private way of a man who had been waiting for confirmation of what he suspected. There were attempts to transfer funds, messages between Danielle and a local estate agent, and a draft contract with spaces left blank for names and signatures. Someone had prepared the paperwork as if the sale were a done deal. There was a spreadsheet that included a list of furniture and their supposed sale prices. The paper trail was messy enough that a distracted eye might call it nothing more than a messy plan. To a trained one, it was unmistakable. This was not casual talk of cleaning or updating. It was organized and intentional. We found a chain of calendar entries that placed Danielle at the estate agent office on the very day she insisted she had been at a family luncheon. We found text messages that suggested she had been coordinating pickups for furniture. Best of all, there were messages from a courier company showing scheduled collections that matched the dates my photographs documented items being moved out. The pattern was precise and undeniable. The pieces fit together like a puzzle that finally revealed an image. Daniel made notes and told me to breathe. He explained the legal language in the simplest terms so that my head would not spin. He spoke of provisional injunctions and temporary restraining orders, but did so without alarm. Every suggestion was a step, measured and deliberate. We would not rush into court to yell accusations. We would present evidence and leave indignation at the door. Justice, he reminded me, favored clarity over noise. I engaged an additional attorney that afternoon, a probate specialist named Lydia Velasquez. She arrived with documents neatly arranged in a leather folder and a manner that signaled competence without theatrics. She listened as I recounted the timeline and then looked through the folders with a practiced eye. When she spoke, she used language that made the path forward seem inevitable. She confirmed that the deed remained in my name and pointed to the emails and courier receipts as prima facie evidence of intent to divest property without proper authority. Her calm focus reinforced my own plan. She recommended obtaining witness statements from neighbors and the courier driver and suggested we request a full production of documents from the estate agent. She also suggested we secure an immediate temporary injunction to prevent any further removal of assets. Each step was a brick in a structure I was building to protect my legacy. I appreciated her ability to turn emotion into action. We began to move quietly. Lydia drafted letters, Daniel prepared affidavits, and I continued to gather statements and photographs. One neighbor named Mr. Alvarez agreed to provide a written account of seeing furniture loaded into a van while I had been away. Another neighbor confirmed hearing Danielle arranging pickups on the phone. The courier company sent a printed record of scheduled collections that matched our timeline. Each corroboration felt like another light switched on in a room that had been dimmed by deceit. At one point, I met with a woman who had been in the estate agent office the day Danielle allegedly attended a meeting. She remembered Danielle because of a heated exchange with the agent over appraisal values. Her recollection confirmed the calendar entry and added a new detail about a name that had surfaced earlier. Small threads kept tying back to the same cloth. It became clear that Danielle had been methodical and that her actions were not born of a sudden moment of spite, but from extended planning. We also discovered a partial draft of a sales contract that had been prepared with my address and a placeholder for my name. The signature line was blank, but the draft indicated a buyer and a proposed closing date. There was also an email from a buyer who had asked whether the property could be emptied prior to closing to expedite the move. Those messages suggested that Danielle had been negotiating a sale before any legal right to do so had existed. The audacity of it left me cold and resolute in equal measure. Throughout these discoveries, I remained composed. It was not a matter of pretending nothing had happened. It was a deliberate choice to preserve my dignity and keep the focus on truth. When Lydia asked for my account of the events, she did not ask me to dramatize or embellish. She asked for facts, and I provided them. Facts have their own eloquence when laid out clearly. They demand attention and require a response. We prepared the documents for submission and arranged to file for a temporary injunction the next morning. That evening, I walked through the house, touching the places that mattered to me most. The study still smelt faintly of old paper and ink. The garden had recovered from the afternoon sun, and the roses nodded as if in quiet approval. It occurred to me that this home had endured storms far worse than the current one. The walls had absorbed laughter and sorrow, and they were now witnesses to the careful restoration of order. The night before the court action, I slept with a sense of relief I had not expected. It was not brash joy. It was the calm contentment of someone who has done the work required to stand firm when the moment comes. We prepared the documents for submission and arranged to file for a temporary injunction the next morning. That evening, I walked through the house, touching the places that mattered to me most. The study still smelt faintly of old paper and ink. The garden had recovered from the afternoon sun, and the roses nodded as if in quiet approval. It occurred to me that this home had endured storms far worse than the current one. The walls had absorbed laughter and sorrow, and they were now witnesses to the careful restoration of order. The night before the court action, I slept with a sense of relief I had not expected. It was not brash joy. It was the calm contentment of someone who has done the work required to stand firm when the moment comes. I had exacted no cruelty. I had allowed no spectacle. I had chosen to act with precision and to let evidence do the speaking. The following day, Lydia filed the motion, and the court issued an immediate temporary order preventing any removal or sale of property until the matter could be heard in full. The relief was immediate. It was not the final victory, but it halted the momentum of deceit. Danielle read the notice with a tightening of the face and a shift in posture that confirmed what we already knew. She had miscalculated the consequences of her actions. In the quiet that followed the filing, I sat in the living room and thought of my husband and of the many small rituals that had made this house into a home. I thought of patience and of the steady accumulation of evidence that had led us here. The turning point had not been a shout or a confrontation. It had been a discovery and a series of calm choices that turned a chaotic moment into a legal reality. The house had been defended by quiet persistence and by those who chose to see truth rather than convenient narratives. That evening, I prepared tea and set out a plate of biscuits. It was a small gesture of normalcy in a day that had been strangely extraordinary. I placed a photograph back on the mantel and smoothed the dust with my palm. The house was not yet wholly restored, but it was safe for the moment. The path forward would require patience and further legal steps. For now, I allowed myself a quiet, steady satisfaction at the knowledge that justice had begun to turn in my favor. The morning of the hearing felt strangely ordinary. I woke before dawn, made tea, and dressed in a simple outfit that had seen more honest days than this one. The house was quiet as I stepped outside, and the garden held droplets like small, patient jewels. I did not feel triumphant or vengeful. I felt steady, a quiet confidence that had been earned through careful work. My lawyers arrived shortly after 8, their presence practical and unflashy, and we drove to the courthouse together in a car that smelled faintly of diesel and old paper. The courthouse had the same deliberate air of ceremony as always. People moved with purpose in the marble hallways, clerks exchanged clipped greetings, and the sound of footsteps echoed in long corridors. We were led into a small room where a clerk took our documents and arranged them neatly on a table. The walls were a soft, neutral color that made voices sound plain and honest, and the judge we would see had a reputation for valuing facts over flourish. That suited me perfectly. When the hearing began, Lydia spoke first, her voice calm and concise. She laid out the timeline in measured sentences, pointing to the emails, the courier receipts, and the neighbor statements. Each exhibit was presented with care. Danielle had prepared a clean chronological binder, while Lydia presented the more interpretive narrative that tied the documents to intent. The clerk placed each document moment into the record, and the room, which had felt ordinary at the start, began to tighten with attention. Danielle sat across the table with a woman I guessed was her counsel. She wore the same composed expression she had worn in my yard, a smile pressed into place that refused to crack. Her fingers tapped a nervous rhythm on the table, and at certain moments I could see the small tremor in her left hand. She was not as unbothered as she had wanted me to believe. That tremor would become, in its own way, a witness. Lydia began with the basics. She read aloud the chain of courier receipts and noted how the dates and times coincided with the photographs I had taken the week before. She then introduced emails that showed a draft contract bearing my home address and a buyer inquiry that referenced an accelerated clearing of the property. The judge listened without expression, his attention methodical. When Lydia finished, she offered the clerk a copy of the neighbor statements. Mr. Alvarez, she reported, had described seeing furniture loaded into a van at a precise time. The clerk marked the statement and added it to the file. At one point, the judge asked a simple question about ownership. The answer was straightforward. The deed remained in my name. That fact, stated plainly, anchored the whole case. Lydia explained how a unilateral attempt to sell or clear property without authorization constituted an actionable interference. It was legal language, certainly, but it also read like common sense. The court respected such clarity. Danielle's counsel attempted to argue that the actions had been intended as a familial cleanup, that no sale had been finalized, and that any communications were merely exploratory. The counsel spoke quickly, using qualifiers and conditional phrases. It was a small performance, meant to create reasonable doubt. Lydia countered with a series of exhibits that left little room for doubt. The emails contained names, proposed amounts, and delivery arrangements. The courier receipts listed serial numbers and pickup confirmations. The calendar entry placed Danielle at a meeting with an estate agent on a date she had not reported. Each item tightened the noose of explanation. When the time came for Danielle to speak, she stood with a poise that had been rehearsed in my yard. She offered a soft, rehearsed apology, claiming she had only meant to help and that she had never intended to cause harm. Her voice was smooth and contrived, and for a moment I felt the old ache of wanting to lash out. Instead, I breathed, feeling the air fill my lungs and steady my resolve. My response when it came would not be a speech. It would be the sum of the facts we had placed before the court. The judge, after listening, asked direct questions about the courier receipts and the communications with the estate agent. As he read aloud an email that referenced a buyer and a proposed closing date, he paused, then looked up. His face remained neutral, but his eyes reflected a comprehension that needed no drama. He turned to Danielle and asked whether she had coordinated any pickups. Danielle hesitated. The pause in her voice was small, but it felt like a fissure. Her counsel attempted to rescue the moment with obfuscation, but the judge would not let the clouding stand. One of the turning moments came when Mr. Alvarez was called as a witness. He described the van, the time, the sound of voices, and the sight of items being loaded. His account was precise and delivered without malice. The courier company's representative confirmed the scheduled pickups and the entries in their system. Each corroboration built toward a simple truth. It was not about malice. It was about a deliberate plan acted upon in the absence of lawful authority. The courtroom contained the quiet hum of consequence as the judge reviewed the documents, then spoke. He affirmed the temporary order and expended it while setting the matter for a fuller hearing. In effect, he halted any further removal, sale, or disposal of property. He spoke of the importance of respecting legal ownership and of the duty to avoid presumptions of entitlement. His language was measured, precise, and in that precision there was vindication. Danielle's face changed, almost imperceptibly. The composed smile had thinned into something strained. She glanced at her counsel, then at me, perhaps searching for the enemy she imagined in me. What she found instead was a woman who had stayed her ground with dignity and law. That realization seemed to unmoor her in a small, visible way. Her attempts to reframe her actions as harmless had failed under the weight of documentation and witness testimony. When the hearing concluded and the judge left the bench for a moment, people in the room shifted their attention back into ordinary motion. Friends and neighbors who had come to show quiet support nodded at
at me with small, private smiles. Lydia and Daniel packed the papers, their motions efficient and businesslike. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with victory over another person. It had to do with the restoration of order, with the affirmation that truth, when carefully gathered and calmly presented, could carry the day. Outside the courthouse, the air felt brighter than that morning. Sunlight warmed my face, and the sitting noise seemed softer. I thought of my husband, of the many mornings we had shared where decisions were made around a simple table with tea and a newspaper. Those ordinary rituals had shaped me more than any dramatic moment could. Today, those rituals had guided my actions. I had not sought to humiliate or to punish beyond what was necessary to protect what was mine. I had sought clarity, respect, and the preservation of a life built with care. We returned to the house in the late afternoon. The temporary order was in effect, and the bustle of removal had ceased. The living room felt like a room that had waited patiently for its owner to speak. I placed a photograph back on the mantel, straightened a cushion, and sat for a long time with a cup of tea. The taste was familiar and grounding. Justice had not come in a flash. It had arrived through patience, preparation, and the willingness to let facts do the speaking. That evening, I walked through the garden and touched the rose petals, which were soft and damp in the cooling air. I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. I felt a calm satisfaction and a readiness to continue guarding the life I had built. The climax of the dispute had been reached not with drama, but with the steady cadence of truth. The outcome was not merely a legal victory, it was the restoration of a voice many had tried to silence. The house settled into a rhythm that felt familiar and new all at once. Mornings returned to their gentle routine of sunlight across the table and the kettle singing softly on the stove. I found comfort in small tasks that had once seemed ordinary and now felt sacred. Making the bed, watering the roses, setting out a plate for the cat who still pretended not to love me were acts of quiet reclamation. Each ordinary motion reaffirmed that life could continue with grace after disruption. Neighbors stopped by with pies and kind smiles. Mr. Alvarez brought over a bag of lemons from his tree and insisted I take them as a small celebration of order restored. I accepted with a smile that did not hide the weight of what had happened. Gratitude and caution lived side by side within me. I was grateful for the support and cautious because the world had shown itself capable of surprising cruelty. Vigilance had become part of my peace. I spent an afternoon cataloging what remained and what needed repair. My hands moved slowly through the rooms, touching the places where dust had settled and smoothing the fabric of a cushion left askew. Repairs were minor mostly. A loose screw here, a scuff to touch up there. The tangible work felt like prayer. My fingers knew the patterns of the house as if reading a familiar book. Each repaired mark was a line of reclaiming, small and necessary. Conversations with my son were careful and slow. He had been torn between loyalty and denial. At first, he had dismissed the issue as a misunderstanding, a family quarrel that would settle itself. Seeing the documents and hearing the testimony changed the way he looked at Danielle. He apologized in a way that suggested more than guilt. He promised to listen, to be present, and to help with what needed to be done around the house. His remorse did not erase the hurt, but it opened a door to repair. I accepted his apology because I believed in the power of change and because holding on to bitterness would only make me smaller. Danielle moved out soon after the injunction, but not with her own version of a story. She insisted she had only meant to be helpful. She offered a scripted apology that did not match the timeline of events. In the end, she left with a box for a few possessions and a car that disappeared down the street. I did not watch her go. I did not give her the satisfaction. Instead, I focused on tending the life that remained and on listening to the small sounds of the house recovering. Friends and neighbors continued to check in. Some shared stories of their own small injustices turned right. Their voices were a balm that reminded me how common these struggles could be and how important it was to meet them with dignity. I found myself offering advice in quiet conversations over tea. My counsel was simple: prepare, document, and do not let anger guide your actions. Let the truth be the thing that speaks for you. There were practical matters to attend to. Lydia helped arrange for secure locks and a new schedule for deliveries so that no one could claim ignorance if things went missing again. Danielle assisted with revising the estate plan in a way that left no question about ownership and access. We took steps not out of paranoia, but out of prudence. It felt right to make the future less ambiguous. There was a relief in formalizing protections that honored the life I had built. I found solace in the garden. The roses had recovered and the soil smelt like rain and promise. I spent early mornings weeding, listening to birds, and thinking about the arc of a life. It occurred to me that resilience was not a sudden transformation, but a long practice. Each season of the garden mirrored that truth. Plants bent in storms but learned to stand again. So did people. At night, I sometimes sat by the window and looked out at the house lit softly from within. Memories rose like quiet ghosts that were not frightening but consoling. I remembered my husband humming as he read the paper, children racing through the halls, and friends gathered around a table that always had room for one more.
Those memories were mine to keep. They had been threatened, yes, but they had not been stolen. People asked if I felt vindictive. They wanted to know if I reveled in Danielle's discomfort. The truth was that I felt only the sober pleasure of justice rightly served. There was no relish in another's fall. My actions had never been about punishment. They had been about protecting the life I had fashioned and about ensuring that my home remained a place of respect. Justice, when pursued cleanly, felt like cleaning a window and seeing the world on the other side more clearly. As the weeks passed, I noticed small changes in the family dynamic. My son called more often and stopped by without prompting. Grandchildren who had been distant returned for visits that were casual and bright. Old photographs were cleaned and rehung with care. Conversation shifted from tension to ordinary plans and future gatherings. There remained a carefulness in how people behaved, as if we had all learned to move with more care around what mattered. I kept a small ritual of writing in the ledger that had always been my companion. Each evening, I wrote a sentence about the day. Notations ranged from the practical to the tender. Today, I had written about the way the sun found a particular patch on the kitchen floor and warmed it in the early afternoon. Tomorrow, I plan to plant a new row of herbs. These tiny entries felt like stitches that mended what had been torn. Despite the restoration, I remained watchful. There is wisdom in softness and strength in readiness. I kept the lawyer's numbers close and reviewed the estate documents annually with Daniel. It was a form of stewardship, a commitment to keeping the legacy intact for those who would come after me. Protecting a life does not end with a court order. It is an ongoing practice. Sometimes when a neighbor asked for advice, I would tell them a part of the story that did not involve court filings. I would tell them about the taste of tea on an ordinary afternoon and about how patience had become an instrument of power. People laughed when I explained that patience was not passivity. They nodded when I said that dignity could be a strategy. Those conversations felt like the true aftermath, the place where lessons prepared by hardship took root and spread. One evening, I stood on the porch watching the sun sink behind the row of sycamores. The house breathed around me like an old friend. I felt a quiet gratitude that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with presence. The struggle had been hard, and the relief had been earned. I felt prepared for whatever future chapters might arrive because I had learned to protect what mattered without losing myself in the fight. The roses bowed to the evening breeze as if in agreement. I stepped inside, closed the door, and set a cup of tea on the table. The house held its breath and then resumed its gentle sounds. The life I had built was not unassailable. It was, however, respected once more. That was enough.